Hi everyone, I am Ms. Macedo. Welcome to our lesson. In today's lesson, we are going to learn about secondary sources. Are you ready? Let's get started. What are secondary sources? Secondary sources are made at a later time. They include written information by historians or others after an event has taken place. A secondary source is something written about the primary source. Secondary sources are written after the fact, that is, at a later date. Although they can be useful and reliable, they cannot reflect what people who lived at the time thought or felt about the event. But they can represent a more fair account of the event because they can include more than one point of view or may include information that was unavailable at the time of the event. Usually, the author of a secondary source will have studied the primary sources of a historical period or event and will then interpret the evidence found in these sources. You can think of secondary sources as a second-hand information. Now that we learned the definition of secondary sources, let's take a look at some examples of secondary sources. Biographies. Biographies are an account of someone's life written by someone else. Example, Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? By Bonnie Bader. This book that you can see here, I have a visual for you. It is an example of a secondary source because it is a biography. It was written by someone else other than Martin Luther King Jr. Another example of secondary sources are textbooks. Textbooks are secondary sources since they try to concentrate evidence from primary documents from history and present them in a way for students to understand. So as you can see here in this visual, all these different books, English, physics, chemistry, history, literature, all these books, textbooks that you have, they are an example of secondary source. Another example of secondary source is newspapers report by someone who was not present at the event. So it's a secondary source. Charts, graphs, or images created after the time period are also examples of secondary sources. Now that we looked at a few examples of secondary sources, we are going to take a look at advantages and disadvantages of secondary sources. Are you ready? Let's get started. Why use secondary sources? Let's look at some advantages. Secondary sources can provide analysis, synthesis, interpretation, or evaluation of the original information. Secondary sources are best for uncovering background or historical information about a topic and broadening your understanding of a topic by exposing you to others' perspectives, interpretations, and conclusions. Also allows the reader to get expert views of events and often bring together multiple primary sources relevant to the subject matter. Now let's take a look at some disadvantages of secondary sources. Their reliability and validity are open to question, and often they don't provide exact information. They don't represent first-hand knowledge of a subject or event. Finding reliable secondary sources can be an issue because there are so many secondary sources out there. Now, it is your time to show your understanding of secondary sources. And you are going to create a secondary source by drawing or writing someone's biography. So you can pause this video now and write a paragraph about someone that you know or about your best friend, write a mini biography. Or you can just draw about that person and it will be a secondary source. So today we learned about secondary sources. Remember that secondary sources are made at a later time, and they include written information by historians or others after an event has taken place. You have to remember that secondary sources are second-hand events. Thanks for watching this video.